Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Hello everybody, welcome to this Talking Tendons podcast. My name is Associate Professor Peter Meliaris. I'm an academic and physiotherapist from Monash University. So I just want to give a quick shout out to a course series in London. I'm going to go for a conference at Queen Mary University of London, which would be really great actually. It's being hosted by Dylan Morrissey there, and it'd be worth checking out. I've also got some courses in Glasgow and Manchester and London, if you're around that part of the world in September. So today's Talking Tendons podcast on a paper by lead author Patrick Corrigan, who's part of the Silbernagel group in Delaware, or at least was one of her students, and it's a really good group because it's very clinical, a lot of the stuff that they do, and I'll try and give you some clinical take-homes from this paper. It's titled Tendon Loading in Runners with Achilles Tendinopathy, Relations to Pain, Structure and Function During Return to Sport. So it's published in Scandinavian Journal of Medicine and Science in Sport, which is a really good journal. So basically what they're looking at is we know that, Achilles tendinopathy is particularly recurrent, so people get it and they get it again, very, very commonly. And one of the big holes in our knowledge is really understanding why recurrence occurs. Is it related to some sort of pain susceptibility? Is it related to incomplete recovery? So they focused on the latter, which is incomplete recovery. So maybe we're not recovering some of their functional capacities, was their sort of underlying hypothesis, and maybe we do need to focus more on these things to allow people to recover. So basically what they've done is they've looked at sort of this rationale of moving away from just pain as our guide for when people are ready to go back to running. Let's think about also how we're returning their function. So the first aim was to look at people that are purposefully, they recruited people who are sort of returning to running. So this was what they labelled in inverted commas a return to sport cohort, because these people were sort of in the process of going back to running. They weren't at the start of their injury phase. They were able to run and trying to build up their running, and they were looking at side-to-side differences in lots of different outcome constructs, so pain, tendon structure, tendon function, lower limb function, and even Achilles load. So they got them to run on a treadmill. Willy is involved with this paper, and he's really pioneered some modelling work to look at Achilles loads through people running on treadmills, and that was part of this work as well. So that was their sort of primary aim, which was to look at all these different constructs side to side in people with tendinopathy to see if in the most affected leg if they're still lagging behind when they're starting to run, which does have implications clinically. The other thing they wanted to look at was relationships to Achilles load, which they modelled through running, and they wanted to see if things like pain and structure and even lower limb function like jumping and calf raise function was related to Achilles tendon loading. And I think the rationale here is that, do we have some markers of Achilles tendon load aside from we don't really have any clinical markers. Can there be any markers or anything that gives us an idea, any of the measures that we do they relate to Achilles load? So that were the two aims. And they looked at runners. They were running more than 30 minutes twice a week. And they were trying to build up, as I said, it was like a return to sport type cohort. And they measured, lots of different lab measures. It was very comprehensive. I think they had 2 visits to the lab where they looked at, visa scores, and they even looked at pressure pain thresholds in the Achilles. They looked at a counter movement jump, drop jump, hopping. They looked at heel raise endurance. They looked at thickness of the Achilles, cross-sectional area. They looked at sort of shear wave stiffness properties, with sort of elastography, but they also looked at classical stiffness by getting them to contract maximally and then measuring how much compliance there is in the tendon. So they looked at, really comprehensive measures. They also then looked at them running, and they looked at then the modelling work of some of the running measures that you can derive, which is things like the forces in the Achilles, the loading rate of the Achilles, and also the impulse. So basically, they looked at all this stuff, which was really comprehensive. What they found, they ended up recruiting 24 runners. 15 had unilateral symptoms, and what they did is something also very clever. They basically categorized them as the most versus the least symptomatic legs. So they didn't have just a unilateral cohort, which I think is quite pragmatic, because it's hard with tendinopathy because so many people have bilateral symptoms, probably about a third. So it's hard to recruit just people with unilateral. So they've categorized them as most and least symptomatic, which, does have limitations, but is pragmatic. And then I'm just looking for some of the main measures. So take home and key findings. There were, as you can imagine, differences in visa scores between legs in pain with loading through the drop counter movement jump, and also pain with running between the Achilles tendons. But if you look at the pain scores, they were actually quite low, because as you can imagine, these people are sort of getting back to running. Pain scores were quite low overall. Pressure pain thresholds did not differ between groups, between the sides, which indicates that maybe that was driven by a lot of the bilaterals that were there. So that was interesting. And there were also no differences in their running measures, so things like the side-to-side Achilles forces and the loading rate and the impulse. And one of the rationales or arguments they gave for this is because maybe it wasn't demanding enough. They got them to run at a self-selected sort of speed that the people would run at during a endurance run, during a long run. So maybe that wasn't demanding enough to see differences in Achilles force and loading rate and impulse, but there was no differences side to side in those measures. What about tendon structure? The tendon, as you can imagine, the Achilles was thicker and it had a larger cross-sectional area. One of the things I thought was really interesting is there was reduced stiffness with the classical stiffness measure, but not with the elastography shear wave measure. There was reduced stiffness, so more compliance, and this was despite this was Young's modulus, so it gives you material properties rather than structural properties. So despite the thicker tendon, the thickness didn't compensate for a drop in the material properties or strength of the tendon. The compliance was increased, so that I thought was really, really interesting. And I'll talk more about that in a second. So key findings was really there was differences side to side for some of the measures still, and I mentioned those before. The visa, the load pain with drop, counter movement jump, the running pain was different. But if you look at the lower limb function measures, counter movement jump and plyometric quotient were lower on the affected side, but counter movement jump and heel raise work were not. And they argued that maybe the counter movement drop jump is a little bit more plyometric, and so is hopping. So those two measures were different side to side. So they're probably good ones to keep an eye on for looking at whether your runners are ready or have recovered function. So that's a really good take-home message from this paper. The only measure that was related to Achilles force was drop counter movement jump. So that was the only one that maybe could be used as a surrogate for, is that related to the Achilles force? That was interesting as well. So I guess key take homes. They've shown that for endurance running anyway, the forces are not different side to side, but there are some functional impairments. Drop counter movement jump and plyometric quotient during hopping are different. So these are things, and again, it reinforces the importance of looking at hopping in this cohort. So that was interesting, I thought, and worthy of sort of considering when you're looking at people return to sport time. I thought, for me, the most interesting thing was the fact that there was more strain, that there was more compliance in the Achilles tendon. So I wonder whether, even though the forces are the same, whether there's more compliance and strain because it's not as stiff. So for a given force, it's going to strain more. And I wonder whether that sets up this sort of tendon for also recurrence, because you've got this situation where the tissue is being stressed more with every stride. So that's something that I've sort of always wondered, and I think is not answered because they didn't measure strain during running, but they did measure the correlate for force or modelled force. So that was interesting. So anyway, lots of good take-homes there. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I really enjoyed the paper, and I think it's a really good one to read for clinical take-homes. As I said, this group is really good with clinically translatable stuff that can help us with patients, particularly at that sort of functional impairment level. Excellent. Thank you very much for listening once again, and I will see you next time.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to AuscastNetwork.com for details.